Thank you for tuning in to another episode of the More Right Rudder podcast. Before we jump into the main episode, we'd like to take a moment to thank the generous sponsors of this week's episode, Lightspeed and AOPA. Both of these organizations are generous sponsors of NAFI, and we hope you take a few moments to check out all that they have to offer flight instructors. We'll include links to their websites in the show notes. Welcome to another episode of the More Right Rudder podcast, the podcast for flight instructors on the go. Today we are meeting with Pat Brown, who is a DPE in Houston, Texas. He's also a longtime NAFI member. We're happy to have him on the show, and our topic today is CFI Reinstatement. One of the things that surprised me the most about my visits with members and non-members at our tent at AirVenture was the number of people I had asking, how do I reinstate my CFI? So we thought that'd be a great topic. Welcome, Pat.
Hey, thanks, Sarah. It's great to see you.
Yeah, great to see you too. For those who don't know, Pat and I used to work together several years ago. So remember in my transition episode where I threatened that if you knew me, you might hear from me to be a guest on the podcast. And that is
I do remember that. And you follow through on that threat. You follow through on that threat. That's all right. I'm pleased to be here.
We're happy you're here. So let's get started talking about just the rules, because like I said, the first question I had was people coming up, and some of them, were professional pilots, some people who had other careers, but were a flight instructor at one point in time. And they're like, how do I even get started in this?
Right.
So the rules are, of course, in the regulations, 61-199. So Pat, could you tell us more about that regulation and what those requirements are?
Well, basically, I mean, the easiest way to think about it is you either need to take a reinstatement check ride. So it would be getting to someone like me that has the authority to do it. Not all DPEs do, to reinstate your CFI. And that would be pretty much a normal check ride. Or if you want to add a rating, let's say that you are a CFI and you want to be a double I, you could add a double I, and that would reinstate all of your CFI privileges. A little bit less common would be maybe you want to add a multi-engine instructor to your certificate. That's a little less common, but once again, if you add a rating, that's another way to do it. So basically, it's a check ride or it's adding a rating.
Okay, so yeah, so it was one flavor of check ride, one way or another.
Right.
Now, it's not necessarily the full check ride if you were doing it for a certificate or rating you already held. The PTS or ACS has separate task tables for reinstatement.
That's correct. That's correct. So what you would want to do, and by the way, you can reinstate whatever you want to reinstate, and again, it'll reinstate it all. In the initial CFI now is on an ACS. The CFII is still on a PTS, but both of them have a matrix contained in those documents that tells you exactly what you have to do to reinstate an existing check ride. So yeah, it's not necessarily the full Monty, but it's not an insignificant event either.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I was looking at it out of curiosity because I've never trained someone for reinstatement and have luckily never ended up in that boat myself. I've got it marked on my calendar to start my renewal coursework in a couple of months here. I expire at the end of January, so I've got a little time yet. And it was pretty extensive. And the airplane CFI ACS, it was 17 tasks. And the double I was, I don't want to say simpler, it was 10 tasks, but of course, it takes longer to shoot a full approach with, inoperative equipment than it does to, do a turnaround point or something like that. So we don't want just the sheer number of tasks to really be the difficulty indicator.
No, that's true. And if those folks that have had, at least some reasonable experience as a CFI shouldn't really find the tasks or the experience too daunting. Uh, I mean, we want you to pass, and we know what it's like sitting on the other side of the table, and we know the anxieties. I mean, we all know those things. So we want you to pass. None of us get any. At least I can't. I guess shouldn't perhaps I shouldn't say none of us, but most of us don't get any kind of thrill of handing out a disapproval. We want to give you the certificate. So the check ride shouldn't be feared, but you need to treat it as a check ride because it is, in fact, a check ride, and it carries all of the weight of a check ride. The approval, the disapproval, the discontinuance, all the things that that a regular check ride entail.
Yeah, you'll be filling out IACRA for it, and
All of that, yeah,
all the usual stuff. So
yeah.
you said in your experience with reinstatements, you are mostly seeing people choose the double I ride, whether it's an
Right.
add-on from, they were, just a CFI, or they were a double I and going that route. So
Yeah.
what's the experience with that, or what might be leading them more down the instrument road versus, 'cause a lot of people are going to get back into teaching those VFR maneuvers, or at
Right.
least start there a lot of the time.
Yeah. Well, I mean, if to be quite blunt with you, it's I don't want to say it's easier, but there's less stuff to have to do. I mean, that's just a blunt answer. Almost everyone who comes to me for a reinstatement, and I don't want to make it sound like, I get dozens a day, but those that come to me for a reinstatement, I'll ask them, what would they like to do for the reinstatement? And I've yet to say, I want to reinstate my CFI. They'll say, I want to reinstate my double I. There's just less stuff to do.
Mm.
And I have had a few folks who have had a CFI and they have expired and they have come to me and they say they want to add on their double I for the same reason. There's just less stuff to do. But again, I want to reemphasize that this is still a check ride. This is still carries the full weight of the FAA, and I've got to put my FAA hat on's got to be up here and all that. But the view is that the CFI is, I don't want to use the word easier, but I'll say less complicated.
Okay, that's fair.
Yeah.
And yeah, because the thing to remember with this is if you're, say you were an expired CFI and you're adding on that double I, or, you had even mentioned, you might add on MEI. That's a really expensive way to go, but you could.
Yeah, it can be. Yeah,
Or even, something fun like gliders. We talked on the podcast about gliders recently.
sure.
So you could do something fun like that and get them all back. But you got to remember when you're doing, whether it's that, category add-on or, the rating add-on for the double I, that's basically treated, it is the check ride. The first time you're taking that, it doesn't fall under that reinstatement table. It's
Yeah,
the whole check ride. And then you just kind of get the bonus of
yeah,
getting
yeah.
your CFI back.
Right. And just because you do that too, Sarah, and I know we're probably preaching to the choir here, but just because you do that doesn't relieve a CFI from the responsibilities of making sure that he or she is competent and proficient at teaching turns about a point, and that's turns across the road and stalls and steep turns and lazy eights and chandelles and all of the other things that he or she may be called on to do at some point down the road. It's still incumbent upon us as CFIs to make sure that we are proficient, not just current, but proficient in performing those maneuvers that we're now being allowed to back into the into the family, so to speak.
Right.
And now we have the ability to the legal ability, I'll put it that way, to teach these things.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that leads into the next topic item of current CFIs helping these expired CFIs get back in the fold. Like
Right.
when I was talking to folks at AirVenture, it was across the board the experience level of these CFIs. Some of them, were military instructors who had let it go, didn't do the comp thing, or it had been too long.
Right.
Some were, retired airline or corporate pilots who just, they let it go a long time ago, never thought they'd want to do it again. And now they're retired going, hey, that could be fun.
Yeah.
Or, flight instructors and, 20, 30 years ago and have had a career in an entire other field and now are again, retired or getting close to retirement or have a little more spare time and say, hey, I want to get back into that. So it's a whole plethora of pilot experience and recency that's coming back into the fold looking to reinstate their CFI. And it's
Right.
upon us as the current CFIs to get them ready. So what would be some good practices for CFIs helping out these not aspiring, but coming back into the fold CFIs?
Well, whether it's existing CFIs helping, mentoring, encouraging the expired ones, or just expired folks wondering what's the best way to go about this. If you still have your lesson plans, review your lesson plans. And I'm talking about reinstating an existing certificate without necessarily going to a new one. For example, if you are a CFI and you don't want to get a double I, so you're just going to reinstate your CFI, or if you're CFI a double I and you're reinstating the double I, either one, look at your old lesson plans and look for what could possibly have been changed. There have been a lot of changes. If you haven't really flown, let's say you really haven't taught instruments in the last 30 years. How long have we had LPV approaches now? It's been a while, but I would imagine they weren't very plentiful, in 1995.
Right. And the NDBs more or less gone. There's a few
and they're gone.
Geographic pockets, but the last airplane I flew that had an ADF, we used it as a landing counter and just ticked off 1, 2, 3.
Yeah. And that's about all they're good for, unfortunately anymore, because I used to like doing NDB approaches. I know
I did one on my not on my double I ride, but on my instrument ride.
I did the same thing. So GPS is new. So making sure that your lesson plans are updated, which is a really good exercise because that actually forces you into all of the various books that are out there, the Instrument Flying Handbook and the Airplane Flying Handbook and the PAC and all of that other kind of stuff. Reviewing the latest ACSs, or in the case of PTSs that still exist, but reviewing the latest ones. The latest ACSs that have been released were dated November of 23, but they went into effect May 31st of 2024. So really just a relatively few weeks ago from when we're recording this webinar. So make sure that the new ACSs and PTSs are in your library and that you know what those changes are. As an example, the ACS for instrument stuff with regard to approaches that are approved for check rides, there's some significant differences there that weren't in the last ACS. So that's really important. Depending on how long it's been since a person has been an active flight instructor, reviewing required endorsements. People don't believe it. When I learned how to fly back when the Wright brothers were still alive, my cross country check ride endorsement was okay to fly cross country with the endorsers with the signature on it. My check ride endorsement was ready for the check ride with the instructor's signature on it. That was it. But now we have a whole advisory circular, which is, that thick, 61-65H. For those viewers that may be taking notes, 61-65H, which has the endorsements in there that have to be placed in a student's logbook, or a learner's logbook, I guess we're supposed to call them now. I'll still call them students, so Sarah, I can't.
I get tripped up. I'm better in writing, and I can go back.
Old dogs, new tricks. So reviewing the endorsements, or at least knowing where to find them, and generally speaking, which ones are required for various things that an instructor can sign a student off to do. To the TSA, that was not a thing prior to 9/11. And so the TSA thing is a thing now. If you're taking on a brand new student, you've got to verify that they're a citizen of the United States and put an endorsement in their logbook accordingly. And if they're not, you've got to make sure that you're registered with the TSA to be able to give them the flight instruction necessary. And this is mostly for independent flight instructors. If you're working for a flight school, there's a little different situation there, but nonetheless, you still have to be qualified in the TSA's in the TSA world to be able to give flight instruction for flight or any other type of flight application like Garmin Pilot or WingX or FlyQ or any of them. ForeFlight is kind of the big dog on the block. But so I'll use that just as a generic term for these electronic flight bags. But man, oh man, in the last, really probably the last 15 years, these electronic flight bags have become ubiquitous to the point where I do check rides with applicants that bring ForeFlight to the check ride, and that's their cross-country planning.
Mhm.
Now, the new ACS, the one dated November 23rd, it went into effect May 31st. The new ACS actually says that's quite okay, and it's fine as long as the applicant knows how to use the multiple functions within ForeFlight. It's perfectly okay. But as flight instructors, it's incumbent upon us as we're coming back into the fold to understand enough about these electronic flight bags to be able to impart that knowledge to our students. So you may reinstate your double I, or excuse me, well, you may reinstate your double I, or you may decide to get a double I to reinstate everything else, or the glider, or whatever the case may be. But again, we're now telling you, okay, you're qualified to go out and take this student from scratch, from 0 hours all the way through to whatever they want that you hold a rating to be able to give them.
Mhm.
And if you don't understand the tools that are out there, you're really setting them up for failure. So I probably have gotten off on a little bit of a tangent, but just to summarize real quickly, review lesson plans, assuming you still have them. Make sure that they're current. If you don't have your old lesson plans, make some more. That will be tremendously helpful as you prepare for this reinstatement ride, if that's the route that you're going to go.
A number of
Review the latest.
a
Say
number of
again?
the pilots I spoke to at AirVenture had never even heard of the ACS. So, when we're looking at old lesson plans, like, yeah, it probably is referencing, stuff that's long out of date, or,
Yeah.
even the philosophies behind teaching have changed. The aviation
Yes.
instructor's handbook is much more substantial than the flimsy little FOI that it was when I went through. It was like 50 pages, and we all pretty much knew to memorize it and go pass the test. And so even
Yeah.
those
Yeah.
philosophies and techniques are worlds different. And
Yeah, and now we have the scenario-based training that the FAA expects, and that's a relatively new thing. It's not brand new, but it's a relatively new thing for someone who maybe hasn't taught in 20 years, or maybe even 15 years. The emphasis on scenario-based training. So, as you said, so many of these folks coming back in may not have even heard of the ACS. When I learned how to fly, there was no such thing as even a PTS. It was just tribal knowledge. These are the maneuvers that you have to do according to the regs.
Mhm.
And the examiners and the instructors just knew that it was plus or minus 10 knots, plus or minus 10
Mhm.
degrees, plus or minus 100 feet, or whatever the case may be. There was never a PTS or anything like that. So, and that takes you back to, well, when I was a boy, but it's true. So all this stuff is relatively recent if you haven't been teaching in a number of years. Again, review endorsements for from 6165H, so you know what it is that you've got to put in their logbooks. And some of the logbooks that are out there now, many of the logbooks that are out there now, Sarah, as you know, have pre-printed endorsements in the back.
Mhm.
Well, that's all fine and dandy, except some of these logbooks could have been sitting on shelves for years and years and years before they were sold. And I have seen them. In fact, as recently as yesterday, I saw a logbook that had the endorsement that requires 3 hours of training in the preceding 2 calendar months prior to the month of the check ride in order to be qualified for the check ride. This one said in the preceding 60 days.
Mhm.
And that used to be true. but now it's in the 2 preceding calendar months. So which is basically could be as much as 90 days. So these are the kind of things, again, the electronic flight bags and so on and so forth, to make sure that you're at least reasonably comfortable with that. You can learn along with the student,
Mhm.
but you need to be able to stay one step ahead of them if you're gonna do that. So those would be the kind of things that rusty CFIs, regardless of what they are currently flying or if they are even currently flying, can do to kind of prepare for the big day.
Yeah, so that's some good advice. And then the other things we talked about, if they are these rusty pilots who've been, even out of the flying game entirely, don't forget about those basics. Like maybe buy yourself an online CFI or double I ground school and go through that. There's a lot of great ones on the market that'll help you bring that knowledge back up.
Right.
An initial CFI one in particular will go through like those kind of fundamentals of instruction and a lot of that theory and stuff that may be rusty that I don't think the double I or MEI add-on
Right.
courses typically cover that as in depth. And then also tag along, go out, be an observer, like just like you did when you were working on it the first time around. Go
Yeah.
observe an active instructor teaching something, whether it's the flight or the ground or a classroom lecture, anything like that. Still going to be good exposure to kind of get back in the game and see the new technologies. The ground schools I taught were all, projectors, presentations, and all
Mm-hmm.
that kind of stuff. We weren't drawing things. We had a website that was a giant E6B,
Right.
not the actual massive cardboard ones that we've all seen and I'm sure in
Yeah.
videos and things like that. We used a website and tinkered it around and clicked the flip to the backside button
Yeah.
and so
Yeah, we've actually at the airport I fly out of, there's actually one of those big cardboard E6Bs that are 6 feet tall
yeah,
in the classroom. It's kind of funny to look back at that old stuff, but it's there.
it's there. Yeah, I mean it still works
Yeah, it does.
for
Sure
sure. The
does.
E6B hasn't changed, but yeah, don't forget, as we're talking about how much has changed,
Yeah.
with the advent of GPS and WAS and LPV and ACS and even the TSA rules changed
Right. Right.
pretty recently. And 61 65, hotel's the current revision, but hotel also indicates it's been
It's been
through
revised.
several and it's likely to change again, because who knows
Yeah.
what may come out
Yeah.
next, as we're looking at potential rule changes coming
Yeah.
down the pipeline some point in the future
Yeah. Yeah.
that may impact endorsement. So always make sure you're looking at that recent stuff, but don't forget about the basics, your good old ground schools and observation lessons as well.
Right. Absolutely. Those are all good ideas.
And so as long as we're talking about good old 6165 hotel, what endorsements are required for reinstatement? Say someone, was a CFI and is just going to reinstate their CFI. They're not going to add anything on.
For renewals, there's no endorsement. If somebody is coming in and just wants to take a ride as a renewal, but the best way to look at those requirements are look at 6165H, and I wrote this down in case people are taking notes here. If you look at FAA Order 8900.1, Volume 5, Chapter 2, Section 11, Paragraph 5-500C.
And we'll put a link in the show notes as close
Yeah,
as
we'll put a link in the show notes to that. That really pretty much describes all of the ins and outs of the endorsements. If I don't know if we have anybody watching today that holds what the FAA considers to be an old CFI certificate, and these are from before November the 1st of 1975. But if that's the case, then those folks are going to actually have to pass a practical test per 61-183, no written test. And if they hold a single, let's say, and a multi, they're going to have to do both tests. If they hold a single engine and a multi and a double I, for example, they're going to have to take all 3 tests. So that's for the really old CFIs. Anything after November 1st of 75, you can add on a CFI, do a reinstatement check ride, according to that matrix that we talked about. So all of those references will lead you to the appropriate endorsements.
Okay, great. So yeah, I don't know how much time the average CFI spends going through the 8900, but it really is a wealth of information if
It
you
is.
can navigate it, or at least keyword search it. Like I said, we'll put a link in the show notes to that, so you don't have to go on too much of a wild goose chase through.
Yeah.
Because the 8900 is, like I said, it starts off with volume number. It's an absolutely massive document.
It is huge. It is huge, but that's the guiding document that we have to deal with.
Yeah. So, but it's really good for CFIs to know how to dig through it, in general, not just for reinstatement. So we'll put a link to that particular paragraph, or as close as the system will let us get. It might just be this section. All right. So when it comes time, say we're working with one of these CFI reinstatement applicants, we've got them up to speed, we're confident in their ground. It's time for them to schedule with a DPE.
Correct.
So from what I understand, not every DPE can do this type of activity. It does require a DPE who has a bit of DPE experience and has a further designation from their FSDO to be able to do this. So what type of DPE or DPE designation are we looking for to do these reinstatement rides?
Right. Well, you wouldn't know from looking at someone's, let's say that an examiner has a business card, for example. You may not be able to tell from the business card if they just have Joe Smith or Josephine Smith DPE. That's not going to really tell you anything. It's mostly the behind the scenes stuff. So for an examiner to be able to do let's just say a reinstatement, then he or she has to have what they call an FIE, like Foxtrot India Echo, FIE designation on his or her letter of authorization from the FAA. And that would allow us to do reinstatements. In order to do initial CFIs, and by the way, the FIE also allows to do add-ons. So add-ons. So to do an initial CFI from scratch, brand new, we've got to have what they call an FIEI, and the I stands for initial. So you're really looking for somebody with an FIE on his or her CLOA, but something, the terminology isn't what's important. Just a quick question to the examiner: can you do reinstatement rides? Or can you do CFI initials? Is really all you need to ask. And the answer will be yes or no.
Yeah, they'll definitely know.
Oh, yes.
It's pretty extensive training on the designee side for all of these.
Right.
But if you didn't want to reach out to a bunch of DPEs, you can always check any DPEs designation types on the designee website, designee.faa.gov. And it's going to look like a bunch of alphabet soup after their name with all, because usually DPEs will hold, it's a different designation for, even things that may surprise you as a designation, like you mentioned, Pat, even, a special one for issuing UAS certificates.
Right.
So you'll probably see this whole big long string of letters, but those are the combinations.
I had mine written down at one point, but there's FIE, FIEI, there's GIE for ground school instructor, there's FPE for foreign pilot. This is when you're issuing an FAA certificate based on a foreign pilot. There's SPE, which sport pilot. There's one for UAS. There's a whole bunch of those things that can be on letters of authorization, and you have to have those authorizations, or you can't do whatever that thing is.
Right. So so just because someone's a DPE doesn't mean it's a universal skill set or authorization. So
Correct.
you got to look in, but the DPE themselves will absolutely know. They've
Oh yeah,
spent hours of
guaranteed,
training
guaranteed, guaranteed.
getting through the joys of the 8900. So okay, so we've already talked about the matrices for each option, whether it's a reinstatement of an existing certificate or a an add-on in your applicable PTS or ACS. So make sure you're looking at the right one there, because like even if you were taking the double I ride to reinstate your CFI, you would still follow the task table and the matrix for the initial double I. So make sure you're doing that. And then, so Pat, as you've been doing this, have you seen any preparation techniques that flight instructors have used with reinstatement applicants, or things the applicants have done on their own that have been particularly effective in getting them across the finish line and bringing that knowledge and proficiency and all that back up to speed?
I mean, I've done a bunch of both reinstatements and initials at this point, and it I would say there's not really one particular technique, um, because it's such an individual thing.
Mhm.
Different people prepare for these kind of things in different ways. I've seen folks come in with 3-ring binder lesson plans, and they sit across the table from me if we're not in a room with a whiteboard, and turn the book towards me and start going through the various lessons. I've seen folks come in with PowerPoint presentations that have animation and music, and it really does run the gamut. I've even seen some folks come in with absolutely nothing and think that they're going to wing it, no pun intended, without any kind of references to anything. And needless to say, that typically doesn't go well. So really, I've kind of seen a lot of different things like that, but there's no one thing that stands out in terms of preparation. I would suggest, kind of along the lines of what you said with ride-alongs and things like that, would be to engage the services of a CFI, preferably not one that did your preparation work for the check ride or reinstatement or whatever it may be, but one that you don't know or it doesn't have any previous history with you, and sit down and have a mock oral. Um, this is this is an exercise in, can you teach?
Mhm.
It's not an exercise in how well you can fly the airplane. You can probably fly the airplane just fine, and yes, you do have to demonstrate that you can, because we're going out to fly the airplane. Obviously, you don't want to scare me, and we want to be able to fly the airplane properly, but really it's more of a demonstration of how can you teach. And that is a perishable skill. If you haven't done it for a while, that really is a perishable skill. All those words, all that patter, and all the catchphrases and things that you may have developed over a period of time, that stuff gets back here in the back of your brain somewhere, and it may still be there, but at some point you got to bring it back into the front, and be able to pick that stuff up fairly quickly and think fast on your feet. So I would consider doing a mock oral with a CFI that I don't know, prior to actually booking, or at least prior to sitting down with the examiner.
Mhm. Yeah, so it's that same back to basics. Make sure you prepare, and
Yeah.
taking a mock check ride is always a great idea. And so, aside from just not preparing and your whole plan is to wing it, are there any other common stumbling blocks or kind of gotchas that get hidden in the corners with reinstatement that would be good for CFIs to know about?
It, it really depends a little bit on what you're reinstating. For example, if you're reinstating a CFI and you're not doing an add-on, it would be probably appropriate for you as the CFI candidate renewing, or excuse me, reinstating, to be in somewhat of a lecture mode when you're talking to me as the student, um, assuming perhaps appropriately that I really don't know anything, and maybe I haven't done the homework that was assigned to me, because of course, Sarah, as an instructor, you know that your students always do the homework they're
100.
assigned. Oh, 100%. If they're adding on a double and I see this a lot, if they're adding on a double I, they forget that they're talking to, or they should remember that they're talking to a student who has at least a private pilot certificate, and should at least have some passing knowledge of vacuum systems and pitot systems and static systems, all, that kind of stuff, at least a basic knowledge of how a gyro works or something along those lines. And what I see almost universally is that they launch into this long lecture about rigidity in space and all of these other things. And number one, they don't ask any questions. And so they start off in lecture mode, and they'll go through this 45-minute lecture and then say, do you have any questions?
Mm-hmm.
Instead of teaching by asking questions. In other words, instead of saying, okay, let's talk about the pitot static system, and then they launch into this long lecture. Why not start off with what instruments are affected by the pitot static system? In other words, ask that question. What instruments are affected by the pitot static system? That now the CFIs enlist the CFI candidate, renewal candidate or reinstatement candidate, is in listening mode. If I can't articulate which instruments are affected by the pitot static system, okay, now maybe we need to start doing a lecture. Same thing. What instruments are gyroscopically driven? Well, if I can't name those instruments, okay, well, now maybe it's time for, well, do you remember rigidity in space and so on, the spinning thing and all that kind of business. In the case of an electronic, let's say um, glass cockpit, how does that work? Initially the question could be essentially, and it could be a professionally asked question, but and the answer is not magic. The answer is, there's accelerometers and there's this and there's that and there's all like blah 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 blah
Magic
blah.
was the snarky word bumbling around in my head there. But yep,
yeah. But if you're sitting with an examiner and you're looking at adding on a more advanced rating to your certificate, then treat it that way, and treat it like you'd really be standing or sitting in front of an applicant who comes to you with at least some basis of knowledge. And let's ask some questions before we just start into a lecture. I'll tell all of these that come to me for that particular thing. It says, don't lecture me. If you see my eyes starting to glaze over, it's not an act. You are putting me to sleep. And so most of them, I've done enough now that most of them, my reputation is don't put him to sleep. And because it literally, they will put me to sleep, and I'll start to nod off. Well, that's just not a good thing, because what's that doing to your student? If you're really talking to a student and you're droning on and on and on about stuff that they already really have kind of a basic understanding of. So our job as flight instructors is to figure out how deep that knowledge goes. Mm-hmm. And let's talk about filling in those holes. And we don't need to talk about the pitot static system if you have a pretty good understanding of how that already works. Maybe you can relate it to how that's going to affect us in instrument flight, but we don't necessarily want to start the lecture off by, here's the pitot tube and here's the ram air, and it goes into the, to the wane shaft, and it does the, the transwobbler does this. And no, that's kind of, from me, that is what I see a lot of, and it shouldn't be like that.
Okay, yeah. So getting them more into, and that may be more of how, or not more, but like reflective of how some of those teaching philosophies and that have changed
Right.
over time as well. Or getting into that question and assessment, or even starting off with a building the whole thing into a scenario, and like the storytelling and things like that are more prevalent. I'm sure there are going to be times where, yeah, you've got to lecture and go back to the basics, but
Yeah.
yeah, understanding the knowledge base that your student should theoretically already have.
Yeah, there's a time and a place for lectures, and I don't want anybody to take away from this discussion that you should never lecture. There's a time and a place for that. There really is, but keep it short, keep it engaging, and there's no reason that even when you're lecturing that you can't incorporate some questions
Right.
within that lecture to make sure that these people are with you, because if the only question that a CFI is asking during the course of one of these lectures is, do you have any questions, when they're done, human nature, Sarah, you've been doing this long enough to know as well as I, human nature is that the student doesn't want uh, to disappoint the instructor,
Or they're not even know
or
where to start.
or they don't want to demonstrate their perceived lack of intelligence because they didn't understand it. So what's the chances are they're going to say, well, I didn't get this. They're probably going to say okay, or no, I don't have any questions.
Right, and hope they
And
find
that's
it on
just
YouTube
human
later.
nature.
And
And so, but don't you remember we talked about this last time? Well, yeah, but I didn't understand it. Oh, why didn't you say something?
right.
But so knowing when to lecture and when to not, knowing when to ask questions and when not to, those are all really important skills, I think, that flight instructors need to have. And if you're reinstating or whatever you're doing to renew the CFI, these are really, really important skills to make sure that you have in your tool belt.
Okay, great. Well, Pat, we really appreciate you taking the time to share with us your insights and experience and knowledge on reinstatement. And I hope our listeners use this and hope they, come across a CFI who's looking to reinstate. They're certainly out there looking to rejoin the ranks, and we're excited to welcome them.
And we need them.
Mhm. All
We
right.
need them.
Thanks again, Pat.
All right, my pleasure, Sarah. See you later.
Thank you for joining us in today's episode of the More Right Rudder podcast. We hope you gained some valuable insights from Pat and look forward to helping out a fellow CFI get their certificate reinstated in the future. Remember, listeners to this podcast get a $10 discount on their NAFI membership, whether you're a new member or renewing member. At checkout on the website, NAFInet, NAFINET.org, use the code POD49, POD49, to receive $10 off your new or renewing membership.